Howdy of you delicious people. I am here today to review Batman Returns. So, after watching this movie, because I haven't seen this movie in such a long time, I had completely forgotten how actually amazing this movie is. To me, I would have to hands down say that this is almost the best Batman movie. Even when rolling in the Christian Bale movies and whatever, I would say that this movie kind of gives you the perfect setup of why the villains are what they are, and really we have it to where this is the best, uh like from first movie to sequel, kind of closure moments where we end up having quite a bit of times where we are to reference what happened to Vicky Vale from the first movie, or kind of some talking about what had happened in the first film to now the sequel. Going into this movie, I really do love the fact of how we consistently have uh, a thing to where Batman has to be active in Gotham City. We end up having, I think really when going into this movie, you can kind of tell how maybe someone was probably thinking of this kind of film when they were thinking about Batman Arkham Knights or Batman Arkham Knight or whatever, the Arkham games. You could probably tell Batman kind of really going through bits and pieces of Gotham, trying to tear through a lot of this Red Triangle Circus gang. Which, why do they have to have that huge long title of this of Penguin's game gang in this movie? We really have it to where in this film that a lot of people could say that this movie actually isn't that great because of quite possibly the Penguin and where of which that they go with this character. But you know what? I can eat up every bit of every hero and villain things going on in this story. I actually kind of like the fact that we end up having Batman who actually has a female interest who we can actually care about, because a lot of the times, basically, especially after in Batman and Robin, they don't even care about the female interest in that movie. That female interest is just a thing that just could be thrown away to eventually Poison Ivy becomes the main focal thing, whatever. uh but yeah, we end up having reasonably I really enjoy what Batman brings to the table in this movie, but I really love the villains a lot more. um we end up having to a reasonably, this is such a an amazing, well-rounded movie. Rather it just being focused on Batman. Uh, it focuses more on the villains, but then eventually, Batman is trying to investigate things, figure things out, and eventually also try and really I like actually the parts of Batman being Bruce Wayne in this film. I think honestly the best parts are honestly just Michael Keaton just being Bruce Wayne in this film. That's the things that I actually enjoy about this film, much more so than actually Michael Keaton being Batman in this film. Because really when or when Bruce Wayne becomes Batman, basically it's just punch and kick and use the Batmobile to take down people, which I enjoy that. Believe me, I do enjoy it. But I just like the Bruce Wayne moments just a little bit better. They're just a little bit more fun. Um, but I do love the fact that we end up having the Batmobile, especially when looking at the first one. it seems like we end up having the Batmobile having a lot more tricks and doing a lot more fun things, to where I think they really actually have a lot of fun with the Batmobile, which I actually think was so much fun. In the sequel movie, we are to also have a different kind of Batmobile like thing that ends up becoming into like a bat boat of sorts, I guess. I don't know exactly what it was called, but to me it looked like a bat boat, I guess. Anyways, here's the thing. I guess there was actually some rough drafts of this movie before we actually got to the real legitimate ways of which that this movie was supposed to be put out. I guess originally in one rough draft of this script, I guess we were actually supposed to get a Robin already put into this film somewhere. But I honestly think there was like way too much going on in this film already, that I think implementing like a Robin in this film was just like, man, that is a lot to like. That's a lot to digest. Like, I think that this movie is about roughly 2 hours in length, anyways. So it's like, dude, how about you just take an entire film and focus on Robin, which I think they kind of did that perfectly in Batman Forever, where, like, really just Batman was just kind of there in that movie, and I really cared much more about Robin in Batman Forever than I did Batman. So yeah, that kind of perfectly like got you to care about Robin in the Batman Forever film. Where in this one, I would have been like, yeah, like I would not have cared for the Robin who would have been in this film. Immediately, I would have just been like, oh, that's great and all, but I could give a rat's crap about a Robin being put in this film, because really, I could have like it would not have been something that would have made this film any better, because really we have Michael Keaton, who was just head over heels just a really great Batman, and Robin would have just been suffering being under Michael Keaton Batman, to be brutally honest. Michael Keaton was actually supposed to be in Batman Forever, but because Burton was out, Keaton was out, and so that's why you end up getting Kilmer in that movie, because Kilmer was contracted to do a number of films with this studio that was doing Batman at the time. So Kilmer was forced to be Batman. Like, more than likely, Kilmer didn't probably even want to be Batman. It was just like, well, hey, like, we have to have Kilmer in a number of these films, so put him as Batman and we'll see what happens. Let's roll the dice. So yeah, I think I've talked long enough about this movie. I love the villains in this film. It really shows perfectly why every single one of these villains become who they are. Really, I think Selena Kyle in this movie kind of sets us up for that nerdy villain. I think she was kind of the blueprint for a lot of other nerdy villains to follow, like Jamie Foxx in Amazing Spider-Man, or Cheetah in Wonder Woman 1984, or any number of those kind of nerdy villain. I think I'm missing out like one other. I know there's another one somewhere in there, but I can't think of it exactly. But yeah, we have these nerdy villains that are in glasses, and then eventually they end up getting like superpowers, and then sure far enough, I'm sure there's another one somewhere. The villain from Green Lantern, sure. I don't know. Uh, the nerdy villain. Anyways, but we really have it to where it's kind of interesting how we end up having an Oswald Cobblepot who is born with deformities, and then he is basically tossed to the side, and eventually he wants to go and seek out his parents and really try to understand and try to get some closure. And really, it's kind of interesting how at first this character seems all good and innocent, and it just kind of seems like he like you can see in the very beginning of this character that like it seems like his intentions are good, because we end up having really Penguin is just a character that like, well, I know that this person is bad, so I'm going to use this person to help me get what I want. And really, what he wants is to be able to get back to the surface and be able to finally have people care about him. And like, I thought that like you can kind of spin this to just be like, well, man, like it actually feels like this character, like you can understand why he's doing what he's doing. You can understand his motivations. But then eventually you get further along in the movie, and then eventually you just see that turn to where it's just like, well, no, like it gets a little too far of just like Penguin just going after people. And like if he's just in all actuality not getting 100% exactly what he wants, which that really starts with him eventually finding his parents, and eventually that twisting and turning of him not being able to get what he wants, then eventually we end up just seeing how much of a chaotic person that, or anarchist that eventually Penguin becomes. Really, Selena, we can understand why eventually she becomes a villain, because really we end up seeing her being forgotten, or we end up having Selena who is desperately trying to also have something in her life that matters, to the point where Selena is eventually to the point of being driven of like, dude, I don't want to be a doormat anymore. Like, I don't want to be walked all over by people anymore. So I am going to finally start walking all over them. And, like, establish how important that I am, that I have a voice. Like, I am important. And that's when you have the, like, I am Catwoman, hear me roar kind of thing, which I really do enjoy. I really do like that whole like we have this person that is becoming a much more aggressive person, because there's only so many times that Selena had been as nice as she could quite possibly be, until she was just driven to just like, you know what, I'm sick of being Mr. Nice Guy. I'm sick of me kind of gritting my teeth at people when I just want to chew their head off, and so on and so forth. So really, I hope that I didn't copy anything that I just said anywhere, because I like that's what happens when you like try to review something and you're like, yeah, I spent a lot of time talking about this, but then I realized that I still spent a lot of time talking about it in cryptic like sense. So really, it's about that time to go into spoilers about this movie, because it's about that time to go out of our way to say, man, this movie was freaking amazing. For those of you that haven't seen this movie in such a long time, or those of you that have never seen this movie, go out of your way to finally see this film, because it is freaking amazing. Uh, excuse me. And I didn't really realize that till like it's been such a long time. Like I remember me always saying that like, but man, those Michael Keaton Batman movies though. And I always like said that those were like the best Batman movies that I've ever seen. And like I would still go and want like I remember watching these movies, the first two, just over and over and over again, and then eventually I would have to just watch the other movies just because I had to, but just to watch something. But I always watched these first two Michael Keaton movies just a lot when I was younger, just because it was like Especially that good payout of Batman Returns was always a really good thing for me. So let's go into, if I haven't already, let's go into now spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we're going to spoil this movie. So, the very beginning of this film is we end up having Pee Wee Herman, who is Danny DeVito's father, which I find funny. Anyways, so we go on and we end up having Oswald Cobblepot, or Penguin, being born. And so we end up having this baby being born to find out that it is defective, that it has some birth defects, that it has some very penguin-esque like fingers and a nose that looks fairly like penguin-esque and whichever, curved nose and what have you. So we end up having it to where we have Penguin's parents just decide to, like, well, just like because this baby is having a birth defect of sorts, like we can't have that in this family, so we need to just decide to take this baby and sadly dump it over the side of the dump it over the side of a bridge and see what happens with this child. So we end up eventually having this penguin being eventually siphoned through these waters to eventually land into eventually a sewer at some point. To where eventually we end up having this circus, this eventually penguin becoming a circus performer, and it seems that eventually there is some backstory of this character that is to tell us eventually that Penguin had become a circus performer, and eventually there had been a death at his circus, which ends up having all of these circus characters leaving the circus to eventually go on their own to, I guess, go on to the underground to eventually go and go on to do their circus gang crime thing. So we go on and we end up having it to be that we are to have Max Shrek, who is to be uh, the guy with, I guess, enough power to where he is to be going on to see the Christmas tree lighting ceremony, and he is the one who is to give a speech at this Christmas tree lighting. Which bizarrely, it seems that this whole Christmas tree lighting thing repetitiously keeps happening within portions of Gotham, and they keep taping it and whatever. I'm like, okay, like this doesn't quite make sense because this not only happens once in this movie, but it happens twice. I'm like, what's up with Gotham and their numerous like places where they just have these like tree lightings? I guess like a lot of people would say it's like, well, in my city, which is blah 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 city, like we do the same thing. I'm like, oh, okay, well, I'm like, I've never seen that to where we've had numerous like Christmas tree lightings and like the same woman lights it up every single time and whatever. So we end up having Max Trek because he is a guy who owns several power plants and whichever, which reasonably he wants to go and leave everything to his son, Chip Shrek, I guess, which is just a bizarre name, anyways. But anyways, so we end up having Max, who ends up going to eventually talking to the mayor and all kinds of high end like people about what they're going to go on and do for the town. And we end up having Selina, who ends up kind of butting in and is like, well, like I have a suggestion, or maybe it's a question. And we end up having Max Shrek is like, well, that's the one good thing about Selina. If anything, like the best thing about her is that she brews a mean cup of coffee, a mean cup of Joe, but that's about all that I guess she's good for, sadly enough. So we end up having it to where eventually Selena is to she is to make her way home, and we end up having Max Schreck, who is on his way to go and make his speech. So Selena is to make her way home to eventually check her answering machine, to eventually have a bunch of just messages that actually she hated, and and so we have Selena who is going through her messages, and one message is of her boyfriend that is going to go on their Christmas treat alone because he ended up talking to his doctor and he didn't want to be some kind of appendage, so he feels like he needs to go on this Christmas trip alone. Where Selena's like, God, I should have let him win that last tennis match that we had together. Maybe he would have wanted to go with me to that Christmas trip. And we end up having Selena's mother giving her a message, and we eventually have Selena who ends up getting some message from some company promoting some cologne. And so when Selena was to open her door, she ends up saying, "Hello, honey." Like, oh, well, I'm not married. And so she ends up like talking to her cat and like talking about how like the cat doesn't like bring home the bacon, and so like she has to go and like get milk for the cat and whatever. So the very last message is that Selena has to go back to work. She's calling herself to remind her that she needs to go back all the way to work to get Max Schreck his speeches for him to go and do this Christmas speech. So we end up having Selena Kyle scrambling to go back to work, get this speech to make it to Max Schreck. Well, Max Schreck is already up and going and making his Christmas speech where he's like, well, Santa Claus, afraid not. Like if anything, I'm just some lucky guy that just really wanted like world peace and love and to be all put together in one nice, neat little bow to give to everyone. Um, but I guess what I have to give is just what I have to give, kind of thing. And so we end up having the Penguin who is hearing this speech from off of a sewer, and he's like, "Yeah, like you're gonna give this to him, like definitely." And so we end up all of a sudden having this big, huge uh, Christmas gift box that is to be inserted in a part of this town. And so we end up having the mayor who's looking on and is like, hey, like, I guess, like, this is like what you were to put up there, Shrek. And we end up having like Max who's going like, no, like this was my idea, wasn't mine. So we end up all of a sudden having this present going and bursting out with these Red Triangle Circus Gang members, and just the onslaught that ends up going on with everybody and the brother from this circus gang going and attacking Gotham. So we end up having Batman who ends up going uh, and using the Batmobile to make it to this spot, this place. And so we end up having Batman who at first ends up going and running over some thugs, and eventually he ends up using the Batmobile to try to take down some thugs, which I actually thought was really, really cool. We end up eventually having uh, this demon guy who ends up using this like flame blowing like trick, and we end up having Batman who ends up lazy Susaning like the Batmobile to turn it completely around, to end up having the back of the Batmobile kind of flame up upon this devil guy, to where eventually we end up having Batman just kind of driving off. We eventually have Batman who eventually gets out of the Batmobile, and so we eventually have it to where Selena Kyle is desperately trying to make her way to Max Schreck, but then eventually realizes that it seems like she is succumb to, like everyone else, to this circus gang. It seems like there is some insane clown guy that is to grab onto Selena Kyle and hold her hostage, to where we end up having Batman, who ends up going and helping Selena Kyle. We end up having it to where eventually Batman is to use one of his tools that we end up having the clown think that he misses him with, but actually Batman ends up tugging onto this thing to where we end up having the wall from behind this clown and end up coming off the wall and smacking both the clown and Selena Kyle down, to where we eventually have it to where Selena is to go and mention that this clown is basically just another man in her life, to where we end up having like Selena Kyle kind of um, like asking, it's like, oh, do you go by Batman or the Batman or like or Mister Bat, or like what do you go by? But anything, we end up eventually having Selena Kyle just kind of looking at the little like shock device that this guy's to have, and we end up having Selena who ends up kind of like using the device against him to just kind of give him a good decent jerk. So we go on to eventually have Batman, who is one by one starting to take down quite a bit of these thugs, which I think was just pretty cool and like a pretty good scene. We end up consistently having Batman from time to time like popping in and taking down these thugs, so it's all kind of very confusing what all actually happens at certain points in this movie. Uh, I think there is at some point in this film where we end up having Batman who ends up going and uh, like taking down like a sword swallower, and we end up having Batman who takes the sword out of this guy's mouth and goes and takes him down. And eventually there's a strong man that Batman is to fight at some point, and we end up having Batman who ends up going and uh, attaching a bomb to this strong man to eventually have this bomb detonate and basically take this strong man out. But I think that happens sometime later in the film. Not right now, but I could be wrong. But anyways, we eventually have seemingly both Commissioner Gordon, eventually the mayor, talking to Batman, and like kind of mentioning about this chaos and all the stuff that had erupted with this circus gang. Uh, and so like that was just kind of like an interesting thing to just kind of like it's great to have those kind of moments where we end up just having Batman just kind of talking to like the people of the city rather than just Commissioner Gordon. Like that's the thing that I actually did like about the Batman films, is we would just have like kind of common talk with Batman and cops and stuff like that. That's the thing I actually liked most about this movie. Um, when Batman would eventually just kind of go into these fray of things. So so here's the thing. So we end up having, where is Shrek in all this? So we end up having Shrek who's at the podium, and we end up having it to where the circus gang wanted to grab Shrek. And so we end up having Chip who ends up trying to protect his father, and we end up having the circle gang like covering Chip with guns, to where Chip is telling his father like, "Dad, go! Dad, run! Save yourself!" So we end up having Shrek, who ends up going on to eventually try and make his way to a dark alley to where he is to not be seen. But while Shrek is walking his way through this dark alley, he ends up dropping himself into a sewer part where we end up having Shrek make his way down to where the penguin is, down underneath the sewer dwelling. So we end up having Shrek who is to talk to Penguin. And so we immediately have Penguin who is to mention to uh, Shrek that he has a lot of things that Max had flushed. To where eventually Penguin is to show uh, bats of toxic waste that Shrek had dumped down in the sewers, some documents that implement uh, that Max had done some wrongdoings, and we end up having it to where Max mentions that it's like, well, if there was such papers, I would have had them shredded, and we immediately have it to where Penguin is like, well, I took quite a bit of tape and taped all those papers together, so ha 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 ha. And also, we end up having Penguin, who is to talk about one of Max's associates that had gone supposedly on vacation, Max says, but instead, uh, Penguin is to show Max this guy's hand and to uh, and to basically say it's like, oh well, this is your associate right here. Like he's gonna give you a hand right now. Like any other body parts or limbs or whatever that you need to see of your associate that you're saying is on a leave or a vacation or whatever. No, his body is stacked right over here off to the side, and so we end up having Penguin kind of stacking the information against Max to forcibly have Max decide to work with Penguin because Penguin has so much dirt on Max. So we end up eventually have Penguin who is to eventually go and uh, have this one umbrella that ends up repetitiously starts to turn in a very dizzy like way, and we end up having Max mentioning it's like, what is that supposed to hypnotize me? And we end up having Penguin who ends up going and uh, who ends up firing off a round of blanks to just say, oh no, like that's supposed to just give you a splitting headache. So we go along and we end up having reasonably Max and Penguin shaking hands because Penguin's real goal is for him to make it back to the surface and to have him find out where his parents were and why that they did the thing that they did. And so we're going to end up having Penguin being shown at first as the hero to eventually he is to win over people of Gotham. So we eventually have Max who is to be let go from the Penguin to have him eventually go to work to try and help the Penguin. So we we go on to have Selena who is to go and forcibly need to uh, look into the Bruce Wayne file. And so we end up having Selena who's working late one night to try to get some information to help out Max when eventually Max is to eventually talk to Bruce Wayne. And so we eventually end up having it to where Shrek ends up talking to Selena, and and he's like, "Oh, you're working late." And we end up having Selena, who's like, "Well, yeah, like I'm ending up kind of really looking into all the information about Bruce Wayne." And we end up eventually having Selena starting to raise some questions about things that Max is doing with his company, and it seems that eventually Max doesn't like what she is actually questioning. And we end up having Max who is telling Selena, it's like, well, hey, like, everything that I'm trying to do here is so that way I can leave all of this to Chip. Like, I'm trying to get as much money as quickly as humanly possible to leave to Chip so that way he could like have the most money that he can possibly make with this company. And so we end up having Selena is like, well, like, what are you gonna do? Are you gonna try to buy my silence? Are you gonna try to bully me? Or are you gonna try to like silence me? Like, what are you gonna do? And he ends up saying like, well, like it all, I could also just like uh push you out a window, or I could also just kill you off. And we have it to where like Selena's like, you wouldn't do that, would you? And we end up having Shrek, who ends up kind of uh like playing at it, just like, oh yeah, like that's what I'm gonna do. And then they both Shrek and Selena just kind of like, oh, I thought you were actually gonna do it. And he's like, oh no, like, and then he actually tosses her out the window to where she used to fall numerous stories to her death, to all of a sudden be licked and bitten and all kinds of weird things with all of these cats. And so we end up having Selena, who is to re-arrive back at her home to eventually go through these exact same messages again. But we end up also having Selena going through the same kind of rung of who she was again, via the first time that we saw her, where she ends up reopening the door to be like, hello, honey. Oh, yeah, that's right. I'm not married. And so we end up having Selena, who ends up going again to answer or to see her messages, and we end up having, I think, her mother calling yet again, and then we end up having eventually that Selena is to eventually get a perfume ad talking about that with a whiff of this perfume, uh, that her boss will ask her to stay late so that way they can have a drink of wine or something together. And we end up having Selena just losing it to where she ends up breaking her machine. She ends up all of a sudden bizarrely like taking a spray can and spraying everything in her room black, which I don't quite understand the symbolism of that. Is her spraying the spray paint to try to say that she wants a much more darker life, or like she wants like, I don't know what the symbolism is with the spray paint, was like her just trying to do something vastly different. We end up having also Selena Kyle taking all of her stuffed animals and shoving that all into a sink where she's trying to cut it and shove it into some kind of sink disposer to where it ends up grinding up and destroying these stuffed dolls. Where again, like I'm trying to find exactly what the symbolism is like, is she trying to get rid of all of her innocence? Like, is she trying to uh is she trying to realize that none of these things that were making her happy actually making her happy? Like eventually we end up having Selena that opens up her closet to see a shirt that has two cats on it, and we end up having Selena who ends up going and spraying that black as well. Were her destroying all these things, was it either things that were making her upset, is the things that she was destroying, or things that she thought were going to make her happy and instead made her miserable? I'm kind of trying to figure out Selena. Like, she's kind of like a conundrum, or kind of like a tough nut to crack at some points within this movie. And some people might have a debate about that, of what they thought that Selena was within this movie, especially in the very beginning here. But anyways, we eventually have Selena, who is eventually desperately uh, spray painting her little home, and eventually goes on to sew up her Catwoman costume. It eventually goes on uh, to make this costume with all these nails and so on and so forth, which I thought was really just amazing. How really this costume is not perfect, but like it looks like pretty awesome. Like I like how dark and how just sewn up this looks. Like it looks really really cool. Like it it's such an amazing costume, and it looks kind of like it's just like the cheapest thing, and that's the thing that I like about it. I like that it feels cheap. I like that it feels very homemade. I like the fact that we end up having this uh like because we end up having so many other movies where we end up having to have the sleekest superhero costumes, and I really hate that. Like, I'm like, why does everything have to be so perfectly uniformed and everything has to perfectly fit and work and whatever? Like, why can't we just go like severely simplistic with some kind of these superhero outfits, to where it's just like, wow, like that looks so odd, but it just works. Like this Catwoman costume just works bizarrely because it just really looks just like a person that is really villainous. Uh, so we go on to eventually have Selena, who is to go on and do her uh, things. Where eventually she is to go out and eventually go to some convenience store and eventually go and uh, whip certain uh, security guards, and eventually we end up having Catwoman going on to eventually try and save some damsel in distress that a guy is overpowering her and and is trying to mug her, and we end up having Selena, who is just like, God, like you make it so easy for any man to take something from you, like to desperately call out for a Batman to try to save you. It's like, how about next time you don't make it so easy for them? Next time around. Like I'm not saying that like all these things happen right after this. Like I'm just kind of saying what ends up happening in the film somewhere along those lines. But uh, eventually the whole like the convenience store thing where eventually Batwoman is kind of taking down some security guards, and we end up having the security guards that are like don't hurt us, lady, we only take home $300 like a night, and we end up having it to where Selena tells him, it's like, dude, you're overpaid. So so we end up having it to where uh we end up having the mayor, who seems to be having some kind of conference or some kind of speech that he is doing, and it seems that he ends up having a baby who is to be at this proceedings. So we seemingly have one of Penguin's guys who is to go and steal the baby and kind of in some way like cartwheel his way back into this back or into this sewer, where we are to have Penguin, who is to take the baby from this circus gang guy and bring it back to the mayor. And so we end up having this frenzy of like, oh my god, this Penguin guy, he saved he saved this uh he saved this baby from this circus gang, which I'm like, no, like if anything, like he just did it just that way he could look good. Like he didn't like there wasn't really much of any real saving going on because really couldn't see anything. Like a lot of it was kind of unsure. So we end up having it to where Batman tries to do a lot of research on this Penguin character and figure out who he is, and so we eventually have it to where eventually Penguin ends up kind of researching who he is, because the whole thing of it is that he wants to be able to find out where he came from and uh, to try to forgive his parents, because really because of his deformity, he could understand that his parents freaked. Um, so we eventually have it to where Oswald eventually goes and find out that his name is Oswald Cobblepot. And so he ends up going and finding out that both of his parents are dead. And so we end up having Oswald, who ends up going to the graveyard to see his parents. And we end up having a bunch of news reporters saying, like, well, hey, like, I guess you're never going to be able to square it up with your parents after all. And we end up having reasonably. Oswald is like, well, true. Like, I'm not going to be able to get the closure that I want. Uh, so so pushing along here. Um, yeah, I just want to make sure that I cover most of my bases. Oh yeah, we have the store thing come up like much later after this. Like I'm gonna have to kind of rebuttal a little bit, but it is what it is. So so we end up going along here, and so we have eventually uh we end up having Bruce, who is finally to meet Selena Kyle while he is talking to Max Shrek about things. We end up having Bruce, who is talking that uh, that Max is tying himself with Penguin, and that Penguin owns the circus gang, and we have it to where Bruce is trying to figure out a way to prove it how that they're related. And we end up having Max who tells Bruce, it's like, well, hey, you know what? Like, if Oswald would have had his parents accept him, maybe you and him would have been college buddies at some college somewhere, some university somewhere. You would have been the best of friends, I'm sure. And so we end up having it to where Max is to mention to Bruce that his assistant is not here because she is off going on vacation days. And we end up having Bruce saying, like, well, actually, that's like the perfect time to go on vacation right now, especially with all that's going on in the city. But like, it's kind of the perfect time because it's near Christmas, anyways. So we end up having Selena, who ends up arriving back in the office, and we end up having Max, who's like, well, like Selena, I guess you like cut your vacation short, huh? Like I guess like because of that accident that you had, uh, like skiing in the Alps or whatever, and we end up having Selena, who's like, well, you know what, like you know what happens when like something just happens to you and it just becomes a complete blur? Like it seems like this moment was like the Michael Keaton moment from the first movie where it's like, you know, when you go and you like you have a family and you you go downstairs and you eat breakfast and you kiss your wife goodbye and you go off to work. It kind of feels like this is like Selena's moment, uh, like in here, which I thought was interesting. So we end up having Selena, who's like, yeah, you know what, like this whole moment was all just kind of a blur, and like I don't know, I just kind of just came back here, and like I just decided to work, and like yeah, like I think I'm fine, but like it's all just kind of a blur. And so we end up having it to where like Selena is to introduce herself to Bruce because like we have it to where like Bruce might have said that maybe they might have met, but maybe again, maybe not have. So we we go on, and so we end up having Selena and Bruce kind of leaving because we have Selena who is kind of ushering Bruce out of the office. And so we end up having Max who's telling Chip, it's like, well, like if she ever tries to blackmail me or whatever, like I'm going to go and try to figure out a way to drop her off of a higher window. Uh, so pushing on. So we eventually have Max who's going out of his way to go and check on Penguin and to eventually show him that he is going to eventually become mayor. Penguin is kind of confused because it's like, wait, aren't like, aren't there voting for mayors on certain times of the year? Like, it definitely isn't going to be now. And we end up having Max, who's like, well, hey, yeah, but like mayors can get impeached, like mayors can get thrown out, all kinds of things. And so, like, yeah, like, really, you're thinking about this a little bit too hard there, Oswald. It's like any number of things can happen. And so we end up having Oswald, who is seeing all these people that are working courageously to try to get Oswald to become this mayor. And eventually we end up having some people kind of treating Oswald like crap, basically forcing him to put on gloves that obviously will not fit, and we end up having a like another guy who is to give crap to Oswald, saying like, "Yeah, I guess there isn't a lot of mirrors that are in those sewers now, are there?" And we end up having Oswald say it's like, well, yeah, but like at least I'm not a guy who's going to be like covered in blood, and we end up having the guy going like, what? And so we end up having Oswald who ends up biting this guy in the nose, which is the most horrific scene in this movie, and we end up having like Oswald just laughing that off, and so we eventually have it to where Max is convincing Oswald to become mayor, and so we eventually have it to where Oswald is convinced, and then eventually we end up having before Oswald leaves these people. He's basically to say like, "Burn, baby, burn," like in some kind of funny like sense. So we go on to eventually have Catwoman go into the store. She is to basically just go into here and to uh, create a bomb to be placed into this store. So we end up having Catwoman who is to get out of this store, and eventually we end up having both Penguin and Batman seeing Catwoman, and immediately once they are to see her, the store explodes. And so we end up having Penguin telling Batman uh, that he saw her first, I believe. So we go on to eventually have Batman fighting Catwoman, and we end up having eventually Catwoman who's to kind of like feel like Bruce or Batman up and down and just like who are you? Like, are you here? Are you there? And then eventually she ends up like stabbing him in the chest. And so we end up having eventually Batman who ends up flinging Catwoman to where she ends up like falling into a vat of kitty litter, to where she's like, oh, saved by kitty litter. So we eventually have it to where eventually Catwoman is to find where Penguin is, and she is to eventually like kind of say that she needs to team up with Penguin to take down Batman. And so they need to figure out how to make Batman look horrible in front of Gotham, so that way Gotham loses trust in Batman. So we end up having it to where Catwoman is to go and eventually eat Penguin's bird that he has, and we end up having Penguin who is to go and have a knife being put to Catwoman's cat, and so we end up having Catwoman who ends up letting the bird go. And I know that doesn't happen right here, but I think that was a really good scene. It was a really cool scene. I really enjoyed it. Because eventually, like, this is just kind of a cool seeing these two kind of teaming up and trying to figure out what to do. So we have it to where Catwoman is wanting to have Penguin try to frame Batman, and so what better way to do that by to try and kidnap the tree lighting woman and eventually try and uh, have it to where like she ends up dying seemingly by Batman's hands, but it's kind of framed that way. So we go on and we end up having eventually Bruce, who ends up just bumping into Selina really just in the day. We end up having it to where eventually we end up having Selina and Bruce kind of talking about like reporters and how like they know that Catwoman weighs exactly 140 pounds. We end up having Bruce, who is mentioning like Batman blows it. Like if anything, like Batman had saved like millions of property damage alone. And so we end up having to where Selina is asking Bruce if she is going to make it to the Christmas tree lighting, and Bruce is like, "Dude, I wouldn't be caught dead there." And so we end up having Bruce, who instead is like, "Well, you know what? How about you come to my home and like we watch it on TV? Like let's just have like something to do if we're not going to be like actually there. Let's go and like just watch it on TV and just be together." And so we end up having to where Bruce is like, "Well, 5, 6, like whenever you want to come by." So I'm gonna pause here for a second. I'm gonna set myself up. Man, we are about like halfway in. Good God. So I was like, how much left do we really have of this movie to talk about? And I'm like, pretty decent chunk, sadly enough. I'm gonna have to figure out how exactly to skirt around a lot of things and like to just kind of minimize how long that this is. So, Selina and Bruce are on their date, and Penguin is going off to go and collect uh, the Christmas tree lighting girl. To where like she ends up mentioning how like difficult her job really is. That really like she's trying to say that she does a lot more than just turn a light on and whatever. Like she has to like stand and pose and look all great and whatever. Like she has to really just say how difficult it really is. Sure, okay, fine. Uh, so so we end up having it to where eventually Penguin was attacked by some uh, Batman device where eventually we end up having a poodle who ends up grabbing it out of the air. And so we have it to where Penguin ends up using this device to go and attack this tree lighter girl to eventually knock her out. And so we end up having Selina and Bruce going on this tree lighting TV thing together. And so we end up having it to where it seems that uh, Selina and Bruce are talking about uh, Bruce's past movie. We end up having Bruce talking about Vicky Vale and how like she used to be a photojournalist because Selena Kyle asks if it was like, well, was she an ice skater or was she like a stewardess? And Bruce says photojournalist, and we end up having to her like this breakdown of Selena asking why Bruce uh, and Vicky didn't work out. It's like, well, uh, Bruce told Vicky everything, but Bruce also had two sides to him, and really Vicky couldn't deal with the dual duality of Bruce, and how bizarrely like Vicky couldn't reconcile with it and Bruce couldn't reconcile with it, and so they ended up just calling it quits after that. To where eventually we end up having it to where uh, really Vicky was like, well, why is it that you couldn't just kind of deal with your duality? And eventually we end up having Bruce mention it's like, well, like if I say one thing about this or one way about this, this will make me like seem like a Norman Bates serial killer, whichever. And so we eventually have it to where like Selena mentions it, it's like, well, hey, like crazies are okay. At least they're like committed to doing what they're doing. Uh, so we go along and we eventually have it to where it seems that eventually Bruce and Selena are eventually just going and watching the Christmas tree lighting. And eventually it seems that they are really getting into one another. And eventually we end up having it to where they start touching one another. And they end up touching one another on their injured spots. We end up having Selena, who ends up touching Bruce's chest, where he is, of course, injured. We end up having Bruce starting to roll down Selena's shirt sleeve to show some injury that Selena had had. And so we end up having both Selena and Bruce like having a difficult time trying to get intimate with one another, and so which they end up just stopping dead in their tracks, basically mentioning neither one of them is like, yeah, I don't think I'm gonna be able to do that, and it's like, yeah, me either. So we go along and we end up having them seeing the Christmas tree lighting, and we eventually end up seeing that the Christmas tree lighting girl is missing, and so we end up having Bruce hearing that kind of news, and he's like, "Oh crap! Like, I should probably get out there and be Batman and try to save this girl who's gone missing." So we end up having Bruce, who ends up scrambling to Alfred, and is like, "Well, hey, like, tell Selena that like I absolutely had to leave because some last minute business thing came up, or like uh, tell her like some kind of something, Alfred." And Alfred's like, "Okay, I have something quite in mind." But shortly thereafter, that we end up having also Selena, who ends up having to forcibly leave because Catwoman. So we end up having Selena, who is mentioned to Alfred that it's like, well, hey, uh, mention to Bruce that what we did was not the reason why I'm leaving. Like, if anything, he's making me feel the way of which that I hope that I really and truly am. And but don't tell him that either. Tell him some kind of sonnet or some kind of riddle or some kind of something, Alfred. And Alfred's like, yeah, I think I have something in mind. And so Selena ends up kind of leaving through the wrong door, but Alfred tells her where to leave this house because I'm sure it's so gigantic and so huge. I bet like she would probably get confused, and a number of probably other people would get confused going into the Wayne Manor of where the heck to go. So we have it to where Batman goes off to go on to try and save the Christmas tree lighting girl, whatever. So we end up having it to where Batman is to make it to this place, this environment, and so we end up having it to where seemingly the Christmas tree lighting girl is tied up, and so we end up having Batman try to untie her, and we end up having Catwoman showing up, and so we end up having it to where we end up having this cool little fight out between Catwoman and Batman here. To eventually we end up having Batman who's telling like Catwoman, "Eat floor." She drops her on the floor to where she's just like she just gets hit. Like a really very interesting scene here. Like it's really fun, and so we eventually have it to where Selena grabs the tree lighting girl and it's like, we need to talk girl to girl kind of thing. And so we end up eventually having Selena, who ends up going and taking this girl to a certain part of this roof. And we eventually have Selena, who has gone missing. And so Batman ends up arriving onto this rooftop, and we end up having the Christmas tree lighting girl who's mentioning, like, well, like, I think I gave her the slip. I think, uh, I think that she realized that like girl to girl that maybe she shouldn't have gone on to this. But we end up having the Penguin, who just ends up opening his umbrella that ends up having a ton of just bats that end up appearing at this Christmas tree lighting girl, to where she ends up falling right onto the Christmas tree lighting thing. So she lights up the tree to death, is what ends up happening. And so we end up having people see that it seems that Batman could have quite possibly had pushed her off this ledge, but none of that actually happened. We eventually have so many bats that end up arriving into the town and kind of hurting a lot of people. We end up having Batman who ends up shelling out his cape to eventually have this become like a Batman glider like thing. So we end up having Batman who glides all these bats, I guess, away from all of these people to protect all of them. So we we have this really interesting moment where eventually we end up having eventually Catwoman and Batman kind of fighting it out. And we eventually have them kind of right by a mistletoe. And we have this really interesting moment where uh, they see the mistletoe, and and I think Batman mentions that uh, mistletoe can be deadly if you eat it, and we end up having Catwoman mention like, well, a kiss could be even deadlier if you mean it. Like, I think that's what they end up saying to one another when eventually they meet this mistletoe. Uh, so pushing on, so we eventually have it to where the uh, to where Catwoman and Penguin get back together, and we end up having Penguin who's like, well, okay, like now that we've technically got Batman on the ropes, uh, let's like go and celebrate this, like you and me just kind of like just going and having like a bedroom business moment together, to where eventually we end up having Catwoman is like, dude, I wouldn't sleep with you to like in all like I wouldn't sleep with you ever. And so Penguin is like, you know what, I don't think I like you anymore. Like, and so we end up having Penguin who ends up taking his umbrella and positioning it to where we end up having Catwoman who's like kind of dangling onto this umbrella, to where this umbrella is like flying off like a helicopter, and it looks all kind of, it's very a cool, interesting visual. So while while Batman is to have done this whole project, we eventually have it to where the circus gang is to also take control of Batman's Batmobile, to where we are to have them kind of rig the Batmobile to eventually have Penguin have complete control over it, to where they modify and they change it. So when Batman makes it to the Batmobile, we end up having a video that ends up popping up of Penguin saying like, "Well, hey, like, welcome to the school of driving," and and we end up having all of a sudden Penguin taking complete control of the Batmobile and driving into all kinds of people. And mentioning to Batman that, hey, I guess I should mention that my license is expired. And so we end up having, of course, like Penguin mentioning that he played this stinking city like a Heart from Hell and all kinds of other things. So we eventually have it to where Batman is trying to figure out in the Batmobile what is the device that is controlling this whole thing. And eventually we end up having like Batman like punching, like touching certain kind of gadgets and punching holes through the Batmobile, and we end up having eventually where Batman ends up going and figuring out exactly where this device is and takes it out. And then we end up having Penguin who's kind of like, well, wait a minute, like, why aren't I able to control this anymore? And we end up having him like forcibly trying to control it and trying to figure out how it works. And he ends up yelling and screaming, and eventually we end up having Batman who's punching the hole in the screen because it's like, dude, I freaking won. I beat you. I bested you yet again. At some point, I think we end up having the Batmobile who ends up having to turn into some kind of like torpedo or some kind of like a smaller version of itself, because we end up having the Batmobile having to get through a narrow part of Gotham to eventually. We end up having Batman who ends up having to adjust the Batmobile to have it be a different kind of Batmobile. So pushing on, so we eventually have Penguin who is to go on and do a speech to become mayor, and so we end up having it to where uh, Alfred and Bruce had recorded everything that Penguin had said during that whole time that Penguin was in control of the Batmobile. And so while Penguin is doing this speech, we end up having Bruce and Alfred playing this recording to everyone to make it seem like Penguin is saying these things onto this mic and onto these mics, which he actually isn't. So eventually have it to where people are like, hey, like, he's not the guy that we thought he was. So they end up starting to pelt him with all kinds of lettuce and tomato and whatever. To where eventually Penguin ends up like firing his umbrella into the crowd and just running off. So we go along to have uh, Penguin's plan is to go and try and retrieve every famous person in Gotham's children. And so we end up having Penguin giving out this information to this guy. I think his name is like Organ Grinder or something. The guy that has the monkey off to his shoulder. So we end up having Penguin going and having all the circus gang retrieving all these kids, and we end up having like one of the clowns going like, you know what, retrieving kids, isn't that a little? And then we end up having Penguin shoot him and say, no, it's a lot. And so we end up having eventually that gang member, eventually that his death is going to come into play because this clown had a gun. So pushing on, so we end up having there being a Halloween party that uh, that we end up having eventually Bruce and Selena coming to. And so we end up having Bruce who ends up just wearing a tuxedo, and we end up having Shrek who ends up going and asking what Bruce came as. So like, are you just a trust fund goody goody? Like, and Bruce Wayne is like, yeah, whatever. Like I have my other costume at home. So we go on, and so we end up having eventually Bruce finally seeing Selena, and so we end up having Selena ask Bruce why did he come to this party, and he mentions he only came to the party to see Selena again. And we end up having Selena who mentions like, well, I'm sorry, but my answer isn't the same. My answer is to go and to basically kill Max Shrek. And so at first Bruce thinks that there was like some affair going on between them, but no, like Selena is just there to kill Max. So Selena shows a gun to Bruce and he just freaking just scrambles and he's like, oh my god. But eventually we end up having Bruce and Selena, like we end up having Bruce that is trying to like talk Selena down and basically just tell her like, hey, like, how about before you do anything, like let's go off to the side and let's just talk. Let's just talk about things. So while they are to start to go off, we end up having Penguin who bursts through the bottom of this uh, thing with his duck in hand, and so we end up having Penguin, who is now telling everybody in Gotham that he is going to go and steal everyone's children. To where we end up having Penguin, who's desperately wanting Chip to come along with him, but we end up having Max, who ends up bargaining for Penguin to take him instead of Chip. So we have a Penguin who ends up having Chip go along with him, and so we end up having seemingly uh, Max and or we end up seemingly having Batman after this, and of course uh, Catwoman after this, just kind of scrambling. So we end up having eventually Bruce is to go off to eventually find every bit of kids that this circus gang is going after, and he ends up retrieving them all and getting them back to a safe place to where we eventually have it to where there's a note that ends up coming to Penguin to basically say that like, hey, like I found all the kids and like everything's perfectly fine. It's like regards Batman or whatever. Like, and so we end up having Penguin who's just so frustrated because his plan didn't work. His plan failed. So we end up having Penguin who ends up deciding like, well, if I can't get all these kids, then I'll just get all my penguins out there with bombs strapped to their backs, and I'll just blow up the city. So we end up having Penguin who ends up taking all these penguins and placing them out all onto the uh, place of Gotham, and we end up having Batman who ends up figuring out how to re-triangulate the signal to have the penguins not go where they are to come back where he is going, which is actually in Penguin's hideout location. So we end up having a tour eventually. Uh, Penguin is realizing that it seems that Batman is coming to where he is at. Because supposedly somebody's giving him a heads up that something is coming very large and very fast. So we have it to where Penguin decides like, well, I'm going to try to get out of here. I'm going to try to escape. So we end up having Penguin who gets onto his duck to try to get out of here, and we end up having both the bat boat and this duck just crashing into one another, and so we eventually have it to where Batman and Penguin are fighting it out, and so the thing that I love about this is that like Penguin mentions that he's a genuine freak and that Batman has to forcibly wear a mask. That is the best thing about this whole entire movie is that like Penguin just has that one-upsmanship of like, well, hey, I'm a genuine freak and you have to wear a mask to look like one. So we go on and we end up having Batman who, when Penguin ends up showing his umbrella knife, we end up having Batman who ends up bringing all of the penguins by hitting this device to Penguin's location. And we end up having Penguin eventually retrieve this device from Batman, and it ends up just having all the penguins all shoot off their rockets all into this location to where we end up having it to where we end up having Batman who ends up going and fighting out Penguin to where eventually we end up having uh, Penguin who is to be shoved back into this sewer and is dropped into this water portion of this sewer, dropped pretty high. So we end up having to where Max Shrek is trying to get out of his cage that he is in to eventually be dumped into this water, to where eventually he ends up finding a gun and he ends up trying to get out of this water. Because we end up having Selena who ends up uh, getting a lasso or her God, what is it called? Uh, her whip, there we go, and grabbing onto Max. So Max ends up grabbing onto this gun. So we end up having it to where Selena is telling Max that she wants his blood, and we end up having to where Max is like, "Well, I've already given blood at the office," and like, And Selena's like, no, I want gallons. Like I want you basically dead. So we have it to where we end up having Batman who ends up like slinging his way, like using some kind of like bat grappling thing, and he makes his way back down to this location. And so we end up having eventually where Batman is trying to talk some sense into Selena and basically mention how him and her are one and the same. How uh how Selena should not kill uh Max because like they need to be together. Like they deserve one another. And so we eventually end up having to where Batman ends up taking off his mask. And here's the funny part. So we end up having a changing of makeup because we end up having Batman who ends up losing his eye makeup when eventually he ends up taking off the mask. You can clearly see that like there's a changing of makeup when you end up seeing there's no eye makeup and he ends up ripping off the mask. You would have thought during that scene and that scene alone you would have not have had the eye makeup there during that whole scene, so that way like no one would know the change up between the two, because that's what really annoyed me was just like couldn't they have just done through that one scene not have Bruce have the eyeshadow on or the eye makeup for that one scene. I think that would have just made people a lot less just like really about that whole scene. So we end up having Shrek who sees now Batman uncovered and it's Bruce Wayne, and uh, we end up having Shrek who's like, Bruce Wayne, why are you dressed up as Batman? And we end up having Selena who's like, because he is Batman. And so we end up having Shrek who ends up just shooting Batman, and Batman ends up falling over. And so we end up having Selena who's like, well, uh, like Batman killed me, Penguin killed me, like I have X amount of lives left. Like, do you have enough in that gun to finish me off? So we end up having Shrek who ends up just continuing to fire away at Selena, and she goes to uh, 6 and 7, all good girls go to heaven, and all kinds of things, all these kind of like limericks and songs and whatever that she could like, uh, 4, 5 still alive. Like these were like this was like such a fun like every little bit about this movie has so many fun things going with it. So we end up having Selena who has one life left besides the one that she already has. And so we end up having Selena mention it's like, well, I'm going to save my one last life for Christmas. And so we end up having Selena who ends up taking that device of which that she got from the clown from the early part of this movie and go and electrocute both her uh, and Shrek together to where we eventually have it to where Batman is like seeing this whole place just start to explode and start to annihilate. But we end up having eventually Bruce who ends up trying to scramble to see what happened to Selena and what happened to Shrek. We only end up seeing Shrek's body and that he is completely and utterly like just skin and bones and eyes, I guess. So we have it to where eventually Penguin is to eventually go and come back from the water to eventually go and pick up an umbrella, which wasn't even the right umbrella. It was some kind of cute one. And so we end up having Penguin mention that he's gonna like, well, like, give me a minute here. I'm gonna kill you momentarily, but if anything, I just need 1 second of me getting a nice glass of cool of ice cold or ice water, and then he ends up like plopping down straight onto the ground, and then we end up having the penguins come in and just shove him back into the water. Um, and so we end up seemingly having everything supposedly resolved. We end up having Batman turned back into Bruce. And so we end up having Bruce just driving along, and we eventually have it to where Bruce is just driving uh, through the streets, and we end up having eventually Bruce kind of seeing something in the shadows that he thinks is Catwoman, but instead he ends up just seeing a cat. So we end up having Bruce who ends up grabbing the cat and bringing it along with him, and we end up having Alfred saying like "Happy New Year, Master Bruce," and we end up having Bruce is like, "Well, Happy New Year, goodwill toward men," and then he ends up pausing and be like, "And women," and so that's kind of like the tail end of the movie. We end up having Catwoman who ends up seeing the bat signal, and she ends up like popping her head, just like ha, and then like so, like I would have liked it if we would have had the same cat suit that she had at like the tail end of this movie, where it's all like disheveled and like you can start to see her hair and stuff pop out through the costume. Like I like that a little bit more, and I think they should have had that then. Having the Catwoman suit, who is now like perfectly fine and whatever, and like it wasn't tattered as it was before. Like it just kind of feels like a shot that's like out of sequence. But I guess recently you could have had it to where like, well, hey, with numerous things where we have it to where like stuff seems like out of sequence, that there isn't enough time for a person to get somewhere or whatever. Like she could have had plenty of time to go home and refix this suit and then come back to where eventually this bat symbol is to go on and Catwoman is to eventually go and uh, fight Batman yet again. But also, like, I didn't really understand the very end of this, to where, like, Catwoman obviously said that she wasn't going to do anything till next Christmas, but eventually, when she ends up seeing the bat signal, she ends up popping her head out. But I don't know, I think it was just, I guess, like a little fun thing to just end this movie. But I also just want to, like, call this a day and finish up this review because this is a really long one. Um, but yeah, I really loved this movie. I really thoroughly loved it. I hope that I covered everything because there was a lot to cover in this movie. So there might have been something that I probably said out of sequence. So there was probably a lot of stuff that I tried as much as possible to rush through. But I also love this movie, and so that was kind of my debating of like how long to make this video. But I'm gonna get out of here to not try to make this as long as possible. So I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.